I want to welcome everyone to another edition of Public Leadership Institute's Policy Leadership Online session. Particularly important that we do. Thank you all for joining. This particular session is going to focus on worker-friendly policies that strengthen the economy, and we've got two incredible and amazing presenters that will bring forth a wealth of policy solutions to improve the economic conditions for working families in Michigan. Just want to take, before I introduce them and hand over the presentation to them, I just want to go through a couple of housekeeping matters and make certain that we ensure that this presentation is as value-added and interactive as we can possibly make it. My name is Dave Woodward. I am Public Leadership Institute's National Network Director. In addition to being a local county official, I'm also a former state legislator, and I'm going to be your host this afternoon. A little bit of background for those who are joining for the first time. Public Leadership Institute is a nonpartisan, nonprofit leadership center really focused about bringing attention around key issues of equity and justice and working with policy leaders to improve the economic and social conditions for all people. You can get a lot of information about our organization as well as a number of publications, many of them that are pictured here on your screen. The Progressive Agenda for State and Local Communities, Voice in Our Values, which is a communication tool, as well as some model bills on a host of issues, including abortion rights. That's on our, you can access all these publications on our website or contact us directly if you would be interested in some hard copies. Like I stated just a moment ago, we really do want to make certain that these presentations are everything they possibly can be for you, which means that we want to make certain that all your questions, clarifications, even reactions to the information that you're going to be listening to today and presented is as helpful as possible. To that end, we have a number of ways for you to participate. If you have audio capabilities wherever you're joining us from, you can click on the hand icon at any time over the course of the presentation, and that will put you in the queue, and that at a time appropriate when we break for some questions, I would be happy to unmute you, and you can ask your questions to our very informed and special guest this afternoon. If you are joining us from a place that's not necessarily an option, you can always type questions in the question bar. And I will try to make certain that those questions get answered over the course of the presentation that we have today. You can also email me at dwoodward@publicleadershipinstitute.org at any time during the course of the presentations. Not always easy to answer it specifically here, but if there are questions that follow up from today's session, we'll definitely get those questions to our presenters and get that information back to you. So we've got a lot of ways that you can bring your voice into the conversation, and frankly it makes it even more enjoyable for everyone who's presenting information today to make certain that this information is exactly what folks who are joining us around the country are looking for. So please take us up on that invitation to make your voices heard and your questions answered. So like I said, today's topic, worker-friendly policies that strengthen the economy. We have with us today two presenters that are going to take us through a series of ideas and research and policy solutions to do that exactly. First, we have Elise Gould, who is a senior economist with the Economic Policy Institute. She's been with EPI since 2003. And research area includes wages, poverty, inequality, economic mobility, and healthcare. She is the co-author of The State of Working America, the 12th edition, and authored a chapter in the Health in the State of Working America 2008-2009 edition. She is regularly cited and a resource that publications all around the country, including national publications, NPR, the Washington Post, New York Times, you name it, that is a go-to person to weigh in on some of these policy questions. As her doctorate, PhD in economics from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and her master's in public affairs, University of Texas. Elise, thank you very much for being with us today.
Thanks so much for inviting me.
Great. I'm going to introduce Heidi as well, and just introduce you both, and then I'll hand over control over to Elise, who will take us through the opening part, the opening presentation here. Heidi is Heidi Shierholz is the senior economist and director of policy. Oh, dropped the Y there. Apologize for that. Also at the Economic Policy Institute. Area of expertise include labor policy, wage inequality, unemployment insurance, long-term unemployment, labor force participation, minimum wage, and overtime. As a result of that, recently finished a stint as served in the Obama administration as the chief economist at the Department of Labor. Really does bring a wealth of information in all of these areas. Again, her work has been cited in many broadcast, radio, print, and online news outlets, including ABC, CBS, NBC, CNN, NPR, The Times, Washington Post, and Huffington Post, and not only an ally in this fight, but brings this lifetime of experience to us today. Also, Doctor of Economics at the University of Michigan, as well as a master's from U of M. State University. Heidi, thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you so much for having me.
Great. Well, Elise, I'm going to hand over control to you, and you can lead us through this, through the first batch of the content that we're going to share with folks around how do we advocate and push worker-friendly policies and strengthen the economy at the local and state level.
Great, thanks so much. So as you've heard, I'm going to be talking through a series of slides that look at economic inequality in this country, long history of economic inequality, what it has meant in recent years in terms of pulling ourselves out of the Great Recession, some policies at the local and state level that have been enacted, and sort of look at a broader picture of where we want to go. And then I'll be handing it off to Heidi. She'll talk more about some of those policy directions, things that we need to do, be active and reactive to. So let me start by talking about where we are now. And to get to where we are now, I want to go back and think about what's been happening over the last, let's say, 30 years, 40 years. And what this chart shows is annual family income growth by different groups. So from left to right, we're talking about the lowest fifth, the bottom of the income distribution, up to the top 5% of the income distribution. And you can see that from 1979 to 2007, income growth was relatively unequal. So at each step moving up the income distribution saw faster and faster growth. What's interesting to note is it wasn't always this way. In fact, in the 3 decades following World War II, adding these dark blue bars here, in the following World War II, we actually saw much more even and stronger income growth in those 3 decades than we saw in the last 3 or 4 decades. So we have seen growing inequality. That's been well documented. It hasn't always been this way. And in fact, then if we look from 2007 to the present, we see similar trends to what we saw from 79 to 2007. Again, the stair-step quality, where actually the bottom 95% really, so we're talking about what's going on in the lowest, in the middle, and near the top also has seen negative still. We are still worse than we were in 2007 in terms of incomes, and the only group that has really seen some gains is at the very top. So here at EPI, when we think about inequality, we often go right to talking about wage inequality, and that's because the vast majority of people's incomes in this economy come from wages. And so then what has happened? Why have we seen this inequality? And one of the key figures that we talk about at the Economic Policy Institute is this disconnect between productivity and a typical worker's compensation. So that's hourly compensation that includes all forms of pay, so wages plus benefits. And you can see that while productivity, which is how much per hour is being produced in goods and services in the economy, as productivity has increased because of people getting more education, because of technological advances, a number of factors, we have seen productivity increase. But then there was this disconnect that happened in the 1970s where productivity continued to go up, the economy continued to grow, and yet typical workers were really not seeing the returns to that growing economy. And then if we think about, okay, what does that mean? We're saying typical worker compensation was relatively flat, very small growth. If we look at that at different points of the distribution, we can see that top line here is looking at the top 1%. So the top 1% saw much of this wage growth over the last 3-4 decades, while the bottom 90% saw very little growth. So we're seeing this, again, the income inequality is tied to growing disconnect between productivity and wages. That means growing wage inequality. Who is getting the returns to a growing economy? It's disproportionately going to the top. If we look then since 2000, we can see again this same pulling apart. So I'm introducing a different data set here. The top line represents the 95th percentile. The bottom line is, further down the wage distribution. And you can see again there's a pulling apart. So you would see the same growth if you saw, let's say, the inequality in 2000 reflected today. Those lines would all be the same. But in fact, the inequality that we saw in 2000, which was on top of 2 decades of growing inequality, continued and continues to today. So that's the context for how I want to talk about what's going on in the labor market today and different policies that we can say. So we've seen this trend. And yet we have had a great recession, right? We saw a huge dip in employment. Here's the Great Recession here. And we have seen that the labor market has added nearly 16 million jobs in the recovery. So we have been slowly and steadily pulling our way out of the recovery. We are not at full employment yet. We still have a ways to go. And, we can have a discussion about why the recovery has been slow, although steady, and I would lead you to a discussion about austerity policies that have been pursued, particularly in the last 6 years, that have kept the recovery from going as quickly as we could towards full employment. But that being the case, we have been adding jobs, and the unemployment rate, another great measure of the economy and the strength of the economy, it shot up in the Great Recession right up here to 10%. And then it has been steadily coming down. So we're now at about 4.7%. And we would expect that will continue to fall. And we will continue to get closer to what I would say is our target full employment level of about 4%. And 4% is not unreasonable. We saw that in the late 1990s and 2000. We actually saw it dip below that for a few months in that period of time. So it's possible to get back there, and we hope that policymakers at all levels of government, including the Federal Reserve policymakers, make an effort to get us back there and don't raise rates too quickly, which will keep that growth from happening and keep the unemployment rate from falling more. And it's also important to remember that this falling unemployment rate is just one indicator of the economy, and it's one indicator of the average over the entire economy. But we know that it differs across the economy where you live for different groups of people. For instance, if we were to look at the unemployment rate of workers by race and ethnicity, we would see that the Black unemployment rate is much higher than the white unemployment rate and has still not come down as far as it had been at previous business cycles. And, they are batted around more. So workers of color are batted around more by the business cycle, as are low-wage workers, as are young workers. And so it's all the more important that we allow the overall unemployment rate to get as low as possible so that these groups can see the benefits of a growing economy. So just as if, as these subgroups are affected disproportionately or differently, it's also important to recognize that across the country, the unemployment rate differs rather dramatically. So you can see some states, and here this is an interactive chart we have on our website. These are the unemployment rates in the most recent month of data in February. And by the colors, you can see that some states have very low unemployment rates, and we can, relative to others. You can click on a state, and you can see that Idaho, for instance, has a 3.6% unemployment rate, and that's much lower than you might see in a state like New Mexico, which still is experiencing about 6.8% unemployment. You might also be curious about how unemployment rates have changed since the recession began and since the recovery. And again, here you can click on the different states and get that information. And I'm happy to share all of these slides or show you where to find these things on our website. If you want to have even more fine detail, which may be of interest to many of the state and local policymakers out there, we can also, we've also created a chart that looks at job changes by county over the recession. So you can see that there are lots of different experiences, the diversity of experiences in the economy, how the economy is experienced, how the recovery has been experienced throughout the country. So let's go again back to what's been happening this year and in last year. Month over month payroll employment growth, so the top line number that people look at in the labor market, that 235,000 in that last slide, that's how many payroll jobs were added nationally in February. We'll get the newest jobs numbers on Friday. We'll be adding that information, and we can take all that information in context. There's been a lot of questions lately about what's been the effect of this new president on the economy. Obviously, we've only had 1 month of data, but 235,000 comes in very similar to what we saw in January, 238,000, or go to the beginning of the graph, you can see 237 in February of the previous year. So we're seeing, so far this year, we're seeing numbers very much in line with what we've seen and in the recent past, and I expect we will see that going forward. Again, as the economy improves, we will see more job growth. We will see the unemployment rate continue to fall. And again, why that's really important is that when we see the economy at full employment, that's really the only opportunity, given the environment that we're in, given that we are in a world where labor standards have been weakened, where collective bargaining has been weakened, where we don't have other ways for wages to rise. In the economy today, we rely on a full employment. We rely on a very low unemployment rate to see decent wage growth, to see increases in living standards for Americans across the country. And so one of the reasons for that, and this is why monetary policy is so important, is that when we look at this as researchers, we see that when the unemployment rate comes down, it's going to disproportionately affect those at the bottom of the wage distribution. So you see taller bars at the 10th and the 20th and the 30th % of the wage distribution for every decline in the unemployment rate. So it's really important that we let the unemployment rate come down so that we can see that growth. And what has happened, in fact, is exactly that. So in the past, since the Great Recession, we actually see, and I'm just going to hide some of these bars here so you can see what's going on. We actually saw from 2007 to 2015, the growth that we saw was mostly at the very top. The 10th percentile, you can't even see what's happening because it's basically zero. At the 50th, you actually see wage growth is negative from 2007 to 2015. And at the top, you see much stronger growth. So that's a continuation of that inequality. But now, enter a world where the unemployment rate has been allowed to fall and has been falling. That should translate into more broadly based wage growth, and that is what we're seeing here. We're seeing at the 10th, at the bottom, at the 50th, right in the middle, and at the top, we're seeing much more broadly based wage growth, and that's what we would expect in an economy that's approaching full employment, and that's what we should expect moving forward if we let it get there and stay there for a longer period of time. So what else besides monetary policy and encouraging the Federal Reserve to keep their foot off the brakes? Something else we've been seeing in the states in lieu of federal action is minimum wage increases. So in 2016, the minimum wage was increased in 17 states and DC, and we also saw minimum wage increases in 2017, but it's too early to really be able to analyze that data. So I can look at what happened in 2016. We see that there were, most of the states actually had legislated increases, a couple had indexing increases, and what my research shows is that when you raise the minimum wage, if you look at what's happened to low-wage workers in those states compared to states that did not raise the minimum wage, those low-wage workers saw much larger gains. So this 5.2%, that's the wage growth of the 10th percentile. So we'll look at low-wage workers that are going to be most likely to be affected by a minimum wage increase because of a growing economy, because of this falling unemployment rate, and because of these minimum wage increases, it is likely that that is what is causing that disproportionate growth at the bottom for states that had minimum wage increases. And this is true for men and women alike. And in fact, it's disproportionately true for women And that's not surprising because women are more likely to occupy low-wage jobs than men are. So you see that whopping 6.3% growth in 1 year, between 2015 and 2016, for low-wage working women in states that increased their minimum wage. And again, so in states that didn't, you did see, again, a modest increase of 2.5%, but nowhere near the 6.3% that we see for women in those states that increased their minimum wage. So what else? And also just I want to highlight that we do track minimum wage changes. We have a feature on our website, the minimum wage tracker, and you can see that we look at any given state. So for instance, let's say Minnesota, it shows you when the most recent increase was and when the next increase is going to happen and what those increases are based on in terms of maybe a rise in the cost of living or legislative changes that are just going to be phased in over time. And we have the same thing for the sub-minimum wage for tipped workers, and you can see which states have a sub-minimum wage, which ones don't, which ones have had changes recently. So another feature on our website. So what else has been happening besides minimum wage increases in the states? There's obviously been some action on paid sick days over the last few years. We've had some states and several localities increase access to paid sick days. And we know that paid sick days is disproportionately found among workers who have higher wages. But what's interesting to see is that access to paid sick days has increased for those lowest wage workers. So the dark blue is lowest 25th% of the wage distribution. The light blue is the lowest 10%. And you see in this period when we've started having these increases, it looks like access has increased for those low wage workers. So there is being great work being done in the states, and I hope to continue to see that. So what else goes with paid sick leave? Another issue that I think is hot right now is talking about childcare. And we know that there are a multitude of problems with the childcare system today. One of them is that there are high costs. In most states, what this shows, in most states, only a small share of families can afford childcare. So this is looking at both infant care and 4-year-old care. Again, just like all the other charts, you can look at the interactive and see what's happening in your own state, the share of families that are able to afford 4-year-old care. It has all the prices, the average annual prices for 4-year-old care and infant care, and who can afford it based on median family income in states, or the distribution of family income for families with kids. And there's other information as well that really key in on the problems with childcare in this country. It's not only that it's expensive and that it is one of the biggest expenses that families face, affordable for many, but also the workforce is very low wage, and it doesn't seem to reflect the values that we have in educating our children, and it also can hurt quality. So we want to think about what we can do to solve the problem, the dual problem of both finding affordable childcare, but also making sure that we are creating quality employment and also quality childcare, which means that you have to pay for it. If you want quality anywhere else in the economy, we believe you have to pay for it. And so paying for that means also paying for these childcare workers, making sure that they are meeting qualifications and we have standards. And there are also other interactives we have on this particular site. So if you're interested in your state, let's say it's New York, we have a whole bunch of statistics on the costs of infant care and child care for different ages and how much it would cost for different families, what that looks like compared to a full-time minimum wage salary, let's say, or what that might look like against an in-state tuition for 4-year-old public colleges. Many people don't realize that childcare is actually more expensive in many states than even in-state public school tuition. And you think about the struggle that many families have with trying to save up for public school tuition, even that for their children. And they have 18 years to save for that, but when you have a new child, all of a sudden you have to pay those same kinds of rates, and you don't have the ability to save for that. So it is a serious problem, and it's also an important thing to think about that comes at a cost for the economy. If we could actually provide childcare that was affordable and high quality, you could increase the size of the economy by increasing the ability of women being able to stay in the labor force and work or return to the labor force sooner. Having more options would be better. We see that in a comparison with many of our peer countries who have kept up increases in women's labor force participation where ours have actually fallen behind. And we care about childcare for many other reasons. There is a huge gap in how well people do, how well children do in this country based on where they come from, their parent income. And so you see this gap from 0 to 5 here in this period. You see that gap growing in terms of how well those children are able to start school, you know, on very different footing. The schools do their best. You see these parallel lines. The schools are doing their best to keep constant and not make any worse those disparities, but they're starting out on very unequal footing. So when we think about child care solutions, we want to take all those different components into account, and we want to ask any given policy that might come up 3 essential questions. 1, does the policy allow all parents the option to stay home with their infants, newly adopted children, and new foster children? Does the policy relieve the cost burden of early child care and education for low and middle income families? And 3, does the policy improve quality by investing in the early care and education workforce? So all 3 of those are essential. And when we look at even that first one there, does the policy allow all parents the option to stay home with their infants, newly adopted children, and new foster kids? It's really key to just remember how unequal access is to paid family leave in this country. Paid family leave, only 13% of workers have access to paid family leave of some amount, and it's disproportionately among those at the very top of the wage distribution. Those at the bottom have very little access at all. So I'm going to turn it over to Heidi now, and she's going to talk about other policy challenges that we are seeing in the environment today.
Am I on? Nope. Show my screen. This is Heidi. I think I am now on. Okay, I'm going to operate under the assumption that I am now in control. Dave, let me know if I'm wrong with that.
You're on. I'm sorry, I was. So yes.
So I'm good. Yes. Okay. So Elise pointed out fabulously, the country is facing a crisis of inequality. There's growing hardship for workers, and it's not just because of the Great Recession, but it's been this dynamic that existed for 3 decades leading up to the Great Recession. And I think, contrary to some of the popular discourse out there, it is not a natural outgrowth of a modern economy. There were deliberate policy choices that led to these highly unequal outcomes. And we are seeing an agenda now at the national level and in many states and localities that is just doubling down on the policy choices that led to that rising inequality. And so I will first say a little bit about the accountability project that we have started at EPI to document and fight what's going on at the federal level. And then I'll talk a little bit about what's going on at the state level, and I will try to be pretty brief with all of that. But one thing that I'll start out with, because I know that I think there'll be some conversation here, is that we are committed to remaining very open to a thoughtful evolution of our work and functions as we navigate this weird and shifting terrain. So we're very interested in your thoughts if there's something that we're doing that we could do in a way that would be more useful to you. Okay, so the accountability project that we have started is named the Perkins Project on Worker Rights and Wages. And it's named after Frances Perkins, who was the Secretary of Labor under FDR. And one of its core goals is to, quote unquote, unmask Trump. And I often have in my mind, when I'm thinking about this, those who voted for Obama and then voted for Trump, or those who voted for Obama and then didn't vote at all in November. We want to do what we can to make sure people understand the impact that the policies Trump is advocating for has on their economic situation, and in particular highlight the difference between his rhetoric of standing by workers and then what he and congressional Republicans are actually doing for, or in many cases, to workers. So in some sense, a way to to say it is, and I know there's efforts all over on this, but we want to really try to generate some buyer's remorse here. So this is one tool that is our Policy Watch tool. You could just bookmark this page. It's a comprehensive cataloging of what the Trump administration and congressional Republicans are doing in the labor and employment space at the national level. We will continually update it. We'll both document what has happened and give the impact on a fair economy. And so you can see there's different categories, like what more obvious ones, like what's going on in job space, what's going on with regulations, what's going on with retirement security, what's going on with unions and organizing. And some of these national fights really do have profound state implications, and I will give you an example of one of those. So in this retirement security section, this Congressional Review Act resolution, it sounds so wonky, and I'm so sorry for that, but we'll get to the real stuff. What it is a Congressional Review Act resolution to block the rules providing for state and local savings initiatives for private employees. When you click on one of these things, you get to a pretty labor-friendly description of what the thing actually is, and then in every case, you get this fair economy impact. Like, what does this really mean on the ground? Who wins and loses from these various things? So with the state savings initiative, blocking the state savings initiative rules, that these are, as far as the fair economy impact, these are actions that put the thumb on the scale for Wall Street at the expense of workers who are trying to achieve retirement security. That's the simple truth of this. These were resolutions that blocked two rules that made it easier for states and cities to create individual retirement accounts, IRAs, programs for private sector workers who don't have a savings program through their employer. The rules that were blocked would have paved the way for initiatives such as initiatives that require employees that do not offer a workplace retirement plan to automatically enroll workers in payroll deduction IRAs that are administered at the state level or at the city level. And it's outrageous to think of blocking this at a time when we are facing a looming retirement crisis. Most people are not on track to have even close to enough savings to maintain their living standards in retirement. 55 million private sector workers do not have access to a retirement savings plan through their employer. So these kinds of alternatives, state savings initiatives, state and local savings initiatives, are desperately needed. So the question then comes up, who wins when rules like this are blocked? It's very clear in this space, that the winner in blocking these rules is the financial industry. They really fought to block these rules because they don't want to face additional competition for their services. So this really is one of those cases where it's very easy to highlight the difference between who Trump said he is siding with and then who he is actually siding with. Okay, so those are federal level actions. At the another reason that we have seen increasing inequality is the unprecedented wave of legislation at the state and local level that tilts the economy towards the rich and away from regular people. When we at EPI have a network of state-level EPI type groups, they're coordinated by Diane Stewart here at EPI, and they are available to support you in your state and local efforts. Please check out this website. You can get to it from the EPI main website. It talks about what this network is. And if you scroll down on the right-hand side, you can see all the state affiliates. And so there are affiliates in almost every state, and many states there are multiple. So it's an enormously useful resource. Just to talk a little bit about what's going on at the state level, the best known effort in opposition to the interests of workers came in Wisconsin under Scott Walker, where the state essentially eliminated collective bargaining rights for public sector workers. But what happened in Wisconsin, as you know, was part of a much broader set of laws that were passed. And I can tick down a couple of those. In the 5 years following Citizens United, 15 states passed laws like right to work limiting collective bargaining. 12 states passed laws restricting the minimum wage. 4 states eased limits on child labor. 19 states imposed new caps on unemployment benefits, and many, many more made drastic cuts in healthcare, transit, libraries, and schools, etc. And in each of these cases, often people saw these things as simply coming from some lone legislator or governor in their state in response to particular economic challenges in their state. But the truth is that you don't get patterns of laws like this because individual legislators in all these places happen to simultaneously come up with the same idea. These things are being driven by national corporate lobbies, coordinated in many cases by ALEC, and then rolled out state by state. I know everyone on this call knows this stuff, but it's sometimes useful to lay it out. One thing that's particularly relevant to an economic is that we know that the reasons that are given as justifications for these laws are actually not the real thing that's driving them. And we know that because EPI's and the EARN partners' work shows that the economic claims that are made in support of these laws, which is primarily that these things will spur growth, are false. The minimum wage does not cause low-wage workers to actually be hurt. Right to work does not spur job growth, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But then the question arises, why, for example, are public sector unions under attack by private sector corporations? I think that's actually a very interesting question, but my assumption is that it is likely their impact on non-union workers. We know that unions increase wages of workers who are not in unions because the existence of unions boosts standards and norms more broadly, even outside of unionized workplaces. So attacking public sector unions in place where they are a sizable part of the workforce is a way to drive down wages and pensions and norms for non-union workers in the private sector by eliminating the competitive standard from the labor market. One of the tactics we see being used at the state level is to actually take more and more things and put them outside the bounds of democratic control through preemption. So since 2011, 9 states have preempted the right of any local government or local citizens through ballot initiatives to raise their minimum wage. Iowa, which is my home state, last month, sadly, became the first state to go backwards, not only preempting new increases, but actually undoing minimum wage increases in 4 counties. 13 states have preempted the right to paid sick leave. And then there's this wave of preemption becoming much broader, with states passing omnibus preemption bills prohibiting localities from doing anything related to a broad set of things. For example, the set might be as comprehensive as localities can't do anything on wages, benefits, paid or unpaid leave, scheduling or work hours, or recovery of wages as a result of wages. There's these omnibus preemption bills that cover all of them. So that's sort of the dystopian part of all of this. But I think it is just always worth noting that at the same time we're sort of fighting the dismantling of laws and regulations that protect worker rights and wages, it is critically important to also show what a positive agenda looks like. The broader EPI economic agenda targets full employment, supports robust wage growth for low and middle income workers through things like boosting labor standards, provides a countervailing power to reduce the ability of the top 1% to claim its disproportionate share of growth, provides workers with the ability to balance work and family, moves us closer towards closing gender and race inequities. I'll just say a few things in the labor standards area, particularly things that can be picked up at the state and local level. The minimum wage, everyone knows this, but remains extremely popular. Across the spectrum, people believe in increasing the minimum wage. The Obama Department of Labor increased the salary threshold below which most salaried workers are eligible for overtime pay. That Obama-era rule is caught up in the courts. It's enjoined nationally. It's very much under threat from the Trump administration. But it is a crucial labor standard for middle-class families. And we at EPI and in the EARN network have resources for supporting states who are interested in doing an overtime regulation or law at the state level, so that's something to consider. Wage theft is when employers do not pay workers the wages that they are owed. It's a big, very meaningfully sized problem. EPI will have a paper coming out on this soon that really digs in on the 10 largest states on the wage theft scene. We'll also provide materials for states to take action by enacting legislation that provides for things like enhanced enforcement and increased damages against violators. And then something that's more appropriate at the city level, permitting can also be used as a tool for labor enforcement. Some cities, most recently.
Heidi, I just want to. This is Dave. If I can interrupt, your mic I think is going in and out a little bit.
Oh,
I mean,
sorry.
Okay,
Yep, I will. Okay, I'm gonna.
We make adjustments. Some people are mentioning that it's hard to hear, so I just wanted to flag that. You're giving such great information. I don't want anyone to miss it.
Yes, that's too kind, but thank you for letting me know. I will try to be very careful. So the thing that I was talking about that's more appropriate at the city level is this idea of permitting as a tool for labor enforcement. So Boston has recently done this. I think they passed something in December. But cities have enacted measures granting city officials the authority to deny, to revoke, or suspend a permit for any contractor with a poor record of worker safety. That's the one Boston did, but the same could be done for workers with wage violations, for contractors with wage violations. And given that the denial or suspension of a license or permit is a very big stick to wield, this could be a great tool for enforcement. So I'll just end by saying that the silver lining in all of this is that even in places where people elect right-wing candidates, on many economic issues, they still have progressive views. And you can see that, 2014 voters in South Dakota and Nebraska, which are deep red states, voted to increase their minimum wage. Last fall, Arizona went for Trump, but also voted to increase the minimum wage and to establish a right to paid sick leave. So on an issue-by-issue basis, there's broad opposition to a corporate economic agenda. They think it's really fertile ground to move ahead on issues that generate greater economic justice. And with that, I think I will turn it back over to you, Dick.
I'm still on mute here. Elise, should I hand over the screen back to you or leave it just on the screen?
No, I don't need the screen anymore.
You don't need a screen.
Okay. We are ready for questions.
Ready for the questions. All right, fantastic. And like we said at the beginning, everyone, we really want to make sure that we get as many questions as possible answered to help support the work that you're doing in your local community, in your state, etc. To kind of kick us off, Bernie, I know that you have a question, so why don't you kick us off, and other people can raise their hand or type questions as they come in.
Thank you, Dave. So early in the presentation, the slides that talk about income distribution, where between the post-war period and about 1979, the fruits of productivity were divided fairly equally among income area groups, and then the rich took the fruits of productivity after that. First, is there information about whether people understand that, whether they believe that? That's very important for politics. And then I'll have another question.
So can you restate that? Do they believe that separation happened, or can you?
Yeah, who understands that, or is it virtually nobody who gets that? And is there any polling about whether people are receptive to that information?
Elise, do you want me to? I'll say a couple things, but please jump in at any time if you have any anything I'm missing. So I don't actually know about the polling, but I think that people feel this. They might not know I'm sure the vast majority of people have no idea about this productivity wage gap thing, but they know what their economic conditions feel like. They know that that things aren't that great, that they're not seeing a huge, that the availability of good jobs with good wages, good benefits, good opportunities for investment, that's just not there in the way they expect. And so I think they really do know this in their bones, and I think that has a lot to do with why we're seeing this populist backlash. So the problem is, they know that this is happening, or something is not right with the economy. People understand that the economy is rigged, that it's not an economy that works for everyone. But what I think there's a real gap in is blaming, sort of putting the blame in the right place. And we really saw with this election about what it looks like when the blame is put in the wrong place. When you place the blame on immigrants, when you place the blame on things that just aren't at fault, or you place the blame on Washington bureaucrats, instead of looking at the many ways that the economy has really been tilted to rig it so that the fruits of economic growth really get funneled to the top. That's the piece that I think is missing in the broader narrative out there about what's wrong with why does it feel so bad to me? People get that it feels bad, but not what who the true culprit.
Yeah, and the only thing I would add to that, Heidi, that was exactly right. And as well, I agree with everything you said. I think that I do some work on the gender wage gap, and that's an area where you can hit up against this issue where obviously there's plenty of men in the economy who feel like they are just, standing still. They're running as hard as they can in the economy, and they are just not seeing their life get much better. And they think, well, how is it that we can close the gender wage gap? It's got to come at a cost to me. But the truth is, if we look over the last 35 years, the growth of women's wages, the growth of men's wages have both been dwarfed, almost equally by the growth in what's been happening with the top 1% or within the top 1% or the growth in productivity, any other way we can measure that inequality. And so there actually is a way that we can close the gender wage gap by looking at the bigger picture and by looking at who is actually taking that larger slice of pie today than they were 30, 35 years ago. And so while it is the case, if we look specifically at the gender wage gap, that the gap has closed somewhat, about a third of that closing of the gap is actually because men's wages have fallen on average in absolute terms. So women have seen some increase in their wages over the last 35, 40 years, primarily because of disproportionate increases in educational attainment, moving into occupations that they had never been in before, just even moving into the workforce in general. But there is some truth to that fact that men's wages in general, in fact, the vast majority of wages in general, have been stagnant. And so there's a tendency to look, at men or women and think, that there's some inequality there, and there certainly is some inequality there, but it's under the backdrop of this huge growing economic inequality that's been happening. And so if we were to target that growth and be able to tell that story, I think that would help. And we actually do have a gender wage gap calculator where we tell the gender story and then try to tell that also in the overall context of growing inequality. I don't know how well that resonates. I am a researcher, not a pollster. I don't know.
Those slides about the increasing income inequality, where can we find those on the EPI website?
That's a great question. I can make the slides that I went through available, and then you can email it out after. I don't have a direct link at the moment.
That'd be perfect. Perfect. The last thing is there data about assets that is similar to your data about income? I mean, you know, logically, as the rich got larger and larger amounts of income after 1979, you'd think that their assets would increase accordingly. Is there data about that?
Yes, absolutely. And Heidi, you can chime in. I'll just give a brief introduction about this too. You know, as much as we talk about wage inequality and income inequality and what that looks like, wage inequality is even more spread apart. So the amass of wealth at the very top is more extreme than what we see in terms of the amass of wages and the amassing of incomes at the very top. So yes, absolutely, the similar story can be told with wealth. And we have wealth data that we have tried to tell that story, not only in inequality across the economy, but also inequality in terms of things like the racial wealth gap, which is enormous and growing.
Great, thank you. I have a question here from Carl. It talks about the chronically unemployed. Right? And his question is, how does this data that was presented affect the chronically unemployed? Specifically, I mean, a demographic that definitely expressed a lot of anger in this last election. Older, middle-aged, like early 60s, just a little too far away from retirement. Is there any additional data as it relates to that? In terms of the economic impact that folks are feeling, and where we solutions to actually help improve the conditions of those folks.
Oh, I can take a stab, but Elise can jump in with whatever I missed. So Elise showed the slide that the overall unemployment rate is actually quite low right now. We've seen a ton of improvement, but those overall rates mask a ton of variation across different places. And there are certainly places that have elevated employment, both sort of in the aftermath of the Great Recession, but that have had elevated unemployment, elevated joblessness, even before the Great Recession hit. So there are places that are being left behind. And I think one of the key things to do to combat that, you know, people often think, when they think about what do we do to help that problem, I feel like people often think we need a strong safety net. We need good unemployment insurance benefits. That's absolutely true. Another thing that often comes up is people say we need good training programs. We need to help people train for in-demand jobs. I think that's also important. The third leg of the scale of the stool, which I think is at least as crucial as the other two, often gets left out of the equation. And that is that it's crucial for the third leg of that stool to help displaced workers or people in places with high levels of unemployment. That's a good job strategy. So displaced workers, one of the reasons that it really is an economic hit when you get displaced is in many cases people are losing a union job that had good wages and benefits. And then union density has been made so low by a giant industry of people who are out there to bust unions that people are unable to find another union job with good wages and benefits. And they can't. And then policies have also not just declining unionization, but policies have also put downward pressure on job quality. So we haven't, in many places, the minimum wage is far too low. Overtime standards have eroded, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So boosting those things, getting a good jobs agenda in place will go a long way towards softening the blow that displacement from a job. Why do I say the word displacement? That's like a euphemism for that job loss, that losing a job, that getting laid off is for a good job strategy more broadly will lessen the blow of job loss for people.
Great, thank you. We have another question here from Linda that's kind of zeroed in on retirement, and you mentioned some of the regs in terms of the shift to retirement savings and everything like that. She asks how is it possible for working families today to be able to effectively save enough to pay for retirement what past generations were able to earn or receive?
It's an uphill battle. I mean, there's countless families, probably the majority of families, who will be living paycheck to paycheck. Sorry. Whatever. Sound just went off in my computer. So it is a part of when you, again, going back to sort of we need to take things in from more than one angle. We need to do things that boost savings, that help people who have savings, protect those savings and make sure that that there's access to good savings vehicles for people. But that is just one side of adequate retirement savings. The other side is we need people to have decent jobs that give them enough wages that they are able to save. And so that, again, you loop back to the good job strategy. It doesn't matter how much wonderful access you have to retirement savings plans if you simply don't make enough money to be able to put anything away. So you need that access to great retirement plans, and you need a good job so that you aren't just living paycheck to paycheck and that you have something to put away. So they're sort of two angles, and we have to go after both of them.
Right, and the question, I mean, your comments about the job strategy, I think, sparked a number of questions, and then actually, I would say, leave with Brian, but there's a few other people. Specifically, are there any states or local communities that have started to are good models for these job strategies that you're talking about?
So that's a fine question. I'm not sure about us. I think that the key is that I think of it on an issue by issue base, and there we are absolutely seeing important wins. So you see a huge number of states and localities that have increased their minimum wage. You see a growing number of states and localities that are getting paid sick leave. I know that there's pushback. There's sort of backlashes to all of that. States are trying to preempt these things from being able to happen, but we're definitely seeing, particularly on minimum wage and different kinds of paid leave, that there's huge forward progress in that area.
But also, when we think more broadly about what is going on in the economy and the states, that it's different, is that some states took the path that the federal government did in terms of pursuing austerity policy and recovery, and other states went the path of building up their budgets and making sure that people had a more adequate safety net, and that had a stimulus effect on those economies. So we think about what can help get those jobs. Again, we need to think about the ways that we're stimulating demand for goods and services, that we're multiplying the dollar in those states and making sure that those jobs are then available. So we can think more broadly as well as we can think specifically about policies that target good jobs.
Sorry, I was on mute again. I think I covered through the questions that have come through here. I mean, I'll give a final call to anyone who has a final question of our esteemed panelists today. An incredible wealth of knowledge and research that's presented here. Additional information that's available at the Economic Policy Institute's website at epi.org. And we will work with Elise and Heidi to make certain that we share that research, the stuff that we talked about today, because I think it definitely starts to effectively frame the the conversation, not only as we talk about the reasons and why things are the way they are, but it grounds it in these policy solutions that are without question linked to expanding equality and opportunity for working families across the country. And it's just incredibly valuable for advancing economic justice and better economic worker-friendly policies to strengthen the economy, like we've been talking about all day. Well, I'm not seeing any questions come through. It's either it's incredibly thorough or people are digesting all the research that was presented. Elise and Heidi, I'll give you guys the final word as we wrap up today, and I'll just say thank you for sharing this this really very valuable information with us.
Thank you for inviting us, and I will make sure that I get a link to you with all of the slides that we showed and the websites that Heidi showed, so that we can make sure that if everyone has access to that information.
And this is Heidi. Thanks so much for inviting us. And again, if there's anything that we can do, products or various things that would be helpful to you, please do not hesitate to let us know.
Will do. Well, great. Elise, Heidi, thank you on behalf of Public Leadership Institute, and thank you all around the country for joining us this afternoon. Stay tuned for future policy leadership trainings around policy ideas like what we discussed today, as well as other communication best practices. We look forward to seeing you next time. Until then, goodbye.